The sky over the Platte River Valley in the last week of February hung low and heavy, the color of an old tin roof left out in weather. The frozen ground had not yet begun to soften, though there were signs if a person knew where to look. The ice on the creek had dulled at its edges, losing that sharp winter clarity, and the cottonwoods along the bank had taken on a faint gray-green cast at the tips of their branches, barely visible in the evening light unless you stood close and looked with intention. Clara Harlow stood at the door of her sod house and looked at the land she had claimed 2 winters past, and she felt the weight of it in her bones, not as complaint, but simply as fact. Welcome to Frontier Secrets. I am your narrator, Elias Vance. Here, we unearth the forgotten stories of the American frontier, the quiet ones, the ones that did not arrive with trumpets or guns, but crept into history through patience and the slow accumulation of right decisions made in the face of laughter. Clara Harlow was such a story, and in the last gray days of that Nebraska winter, she was about to do something that would make her, for a time, the most quietly ridiculed woman in Cutter's Bend. Picture her there in the doorway, her hand resting against the swollen frame of the door. She was a woman of 31 years, though she looked older in the winter months when the cold pressed the color from her face, and the work of survival carved its lines around her mouth and eyes. She had come to this valley alone, without a husband or a father or a brother to speak for her at the land office, which had drawn looks of a particular kind from the men who assembled there on filing days. She had not minded the looks. She had minded that the clerk had addressed every question to the nearest male bystander before finally, reluctantly, turning to her. She had answered each question herself, in a voice that did not rise and did not waver, and she had walked out with the deed to 160 acres of low ground along Sallow Creek. That was 2 years and 3 months ago. She had spent the first summer digging a well and the first winter learning what it meant to be truly alone on the prairie, with nothing between herself and the sky but the roof she had cut and laid with her own hands. The second summer she had planted corn in a field she had broken with a borrowed plow, and a mule she had traded for a grandmother's cameo brooch. The corn had come up thin and pale, the soil too heavy and too wet for the roots to breathe. By August, the stalks had yellowed, and the ears had failed to fill. She had harvested what she could, fed the dry stalks to the mule, and sat down with her cloth-covered journal to write out what she had learned. The soil held water. The corn could not stand it. If she was going to survive on this land, she would have to think differently about how a thing was planted. She began to watch the water. Not the rain, not the creek's surface, but the ground itself, the way it accepted moisture and released it. She dug small test holes at intervals across her quarter section, measured how long each held standing water after a rain. She noted the high water marks on the cottonwoods, the faint discolorations in the bark that recorded the reach of past floods. She walked the fence lines of neighbors who had been here longer than she had, and she asked questions, 1 or 2 at a time, in a voice that invited answers without demanding them. The older settlers spoke of 2 floods in the previous dozen years, one that had taken the lower fields and one that had taken almost everything. They spoke of it with the flatness of people who have accepted a thing rather than mastered it. She listened to every word and wrote nothing down while they spoke. But later, inside the sod house, she opened the journal and recorded each detail in her small, precise hand. The creek could rise fast in a warm April when the snowmelt came down all at once. The heavy soil could hold enough water to drown a root before the week was out. The land was good, but it was not forgiving. She thought about this through the long evenings of February, when the wind scraped across the prairie and the sky stayed the color of pewter from morning to night. She thought about what it would mean to plant above the water rather than in it. She thought about containers, about raised surfaces, about something she had seen once on a visit to a German settlement east of the river, where an old woman had grown herbs in a hollowed log turned on its side. She turned the idea over in her mind, the way a woman turns a smooth stone in her palm, feeling its weight and its edges, considering its possibilities. And then, in the last days of that long February, she began to collect boots. She started with the pile behind the barn at the Granger place. Silas Granger was a man of 53 years who had been farming the high ground east of Sallow Creek for nearly 30 years. He was not a cruel man, but he was a settled one. He knew the way things were done, and he had no patience for deviations. When Clara Harlow appeared at his barn door on a cold Tuesday morning with a burlap sack folded under her arm, and asked if she might take some of the old boots from the heap behind his fence line, he looked at her the way a man looks at a fence post that has begun to lean, with mild curiosity and no intention of straightening it. She said she had a use for them. He asked, what use? She said she would rather not say until she was sure it would work. He snorted, a sound that was not quite a laugh but close enough, and waved his hand toward the pile. "Take them," he said. "They're no good to me." She thanked him and walked to the heap and began to sort through it with the methodical attention of a woman who has a plan she does not intend to explain. The pile held boots of every description. Tall cavalry boots with cracked leather tops, short work boots with split soles, a pair of women's button boots that had been abandoned so long that one of the buttons had grown a small patch of moss along its brass edge. Clara sorted by condition, not by appearance. She was looking for structure. A boot that had split along the sole seam could still hold soil if the leather walls remained intact. A boot with a missing heel could be balanced against a stone. She filled the burlap sack until it was heavy enough to strain the seams, slung it over her shoulder, and started back across the frozen ground toward her claim. She made 5 more trips over the next 2 weeks. She visited the wagon camp at the south bend of Sallow Creek, where the travelers left their broken things in a heap near the fire pit. She visited the trading post, where the storekeeper kept a barrel of unclaimed items near the door, boots and shoes, and one child's slipper that had been waiting for an owner so long that the leather had begun to curl. She visited the Hennessy farm, where a woman with tired eyes and a kind voice said she had a box of old boots in the barn that she had been meaning to burn. "Take them," she said. "Take them all." Clara took them all. The first person to remark on it publicly was a man named Jonas Teal, who ran the grist mill on the upper reach of the creek. He saw Clara walking the road with a sack of boots and called out to her from the mill door, asking if she had taken up cobbling. She said she had not. He asked what she was doing with them then. She said she was planting in them. He laughed, not unkindly but fully, a laugh that carried across the yard and into the mill, where 2 other men heard it and laughed as well. She did not stop walking. She did not turn her head. She carried the sack home and added its contents to the growing pile behind the sod house, and began the work of sorting them by size and condition. By the end of the first week of March, she had 47 boots arranged in rows on the frozen ground, their openings gaping upward like a field of odd flowers waiting for their season. She went inside and opened the journal and made a note. 47 boots, she wrote. Tomorrow I begin the soil mixture. She mixed the soil in an old tin wash basin, testing the proportions with her hands, adjusting by feel. Wood ash from the stove, fine and gray, for the minerals it would provide. Silt from the quiet bend of the creek where the water ran slow and the sediment settled into something almost silky. Composted straw from the pile she had turned since autumn, dark and crumbly and smelling of rich earth. She mixed them in ratios she had worked out on paper first. 1 part ash, 2 parts silt, 3 parts compost, adding water a few drops at a time until the mixture held together when she pressed it in her palm without dripping. She filled the first boot with this mixture, packing it gently, leaving a hollow in the center the size of her thumb. She set it on a flat stone and looked at it. Then she filled the next, and the next, and the next. She worked through the morning and into the afternoon, pausing only to re-warm her hands over the stove. By the time the light began to fade, 22 boots stood in a row on the flat stones, dark with moisture, ready. She went inside and built up the fire and wrote in the journal the date, the number, the mixture, the temperature. Then she sat in the quiet and listened to the wind pass over the roof and thought about the seeds she would press into the soil in the morning. If these forgotten stories of the frontier speak to your heart, subscribe to Frontier Secrets and stay by the fire a little longer. The story of Clara Harlow is far from finished. She planted the first seeds the following morning, before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. Beans in the widest boots, 1 seed per boot, pressed to the depth of her first knuckle. Turnips in the narrower boots, where the leather walls would guide the root straight down. Squash in the largest pairs, where the volume of soil would give the vine room to spread. Kale in whatever remained, filling the gaps, using every boot she had. She worked slowly, seed by seed, boot by boot, pausing between each one to press the soil firm and smooth the surface with her palm. It was a rhythm she had not practiced before, but she found it natural enough. The repetition of a small gesture performed many times in a row, each one identical and each one necessary. By noon she had planted every boot. She stood back and looked at the rows, 47 boots standing on their flat stones, dark with moisture, each one holding a seed that would either grow or not, depending on conditions she had done her best to anticipate. She was not nervous. Nerves required a kind of hope she had never been good at. She was watchful. She went inside and wrote in the journal. 47 seeds planted, she wrote. Then she went out to check the creek. The water was running clear and cold, the level below the notch she had cut into the measuring stick the previous autumn. She crouched at the bank and dipped her fingers into the current. It was cold enough to ache. She dried her hand on her apron and stood and looked upstream, where the horizon wavered in the gray light. The snow would begin to melt soon. She could feel it in the air, a softening at the edge of each afternoon, a change in the quality of light that came before the change in temperature. She had been watching for it since February. Now it was here. She walked back to the sod house and looked at the boots, standing in their rows, and she felt something move in her chest that was not quite satisfaction and was not quite worry. It was the feeling of having placed a bet on something she believed in and having nothing left to do but wait. She went inside and closed the door and set water on to boil. The boots stood in the fading light, patient and odd and full of secret potential. And a mile up the creek, Jonas Teal was telling the story at the mill again, adding a detail this time about how she had asked for old boots, how she had filled them with dirt, how she had planted seeds in them like a woman who had forgotten how farming worked. The men laughed again, and the story traveled. And by the time the week had ended, the entire valley had heard the name of Clara Harlow and the strange things she was doing on her low quarter section. Most of them had laughed. Some had shaken their heads. A few had wondered, but only quietly, and only for a moment. The laughter was easier. The days passed. The seeds did what seeds do when they are given the right conditions, which is to say they began to grow, though slowly, in a way that would have been invisible to anyone who was not watching closely. Clara watched closely. She came out each morning before full light and walked the rows, crouching at each boot to examine the soil surface for the first signs of emergence. She watered each one from a tin dipper, aiming the stream at the base of the boot rather than the soil surface so that the water soaked in slowly from below. She noted in the journal which boots dried fastest, which held moisture longest, which showed cracks forming in the leather where the sun beat down hardest. She was learning the behavior of each one, the way a person learns the personality of an animal over time, through proximity and attention. And late in the second week, the first bean emerged, a pale curl of stem pushing up through the dark soil in a cavalry boot whose leather had been cracked and stiff when she found it, and was now dark and supple from the moisture. She did not smile. She did not whisper to it. She simply noted the date in the journal and moved to the next boot, checking the soil, adjusting the angle, looking for the next sign. It came 3 days later, then 4, then 2 more. By the end of March, 33 of the 47 boots had sent up seedlings, and of those 33, 28 looked strong enough to survive. She wrote down the numbers and closed the journal and went outside and looked at the creek again. The water had risen 4 inches since the beginning of the month. The notch she had cut in the measuring stick now sat an inch below the surface. She crouched and touched the water and brought her fingers to her nose. There was a new smell in it, something mineral and cold, the smell of snow that had been ice and was now beginning to move. She stood and looked at the rows of boots, at the small green plants rising from them, and she felt the weight of the season pressing down on everything she had done. The creek was rising, the boots were holding, and the valley had no idea what was coming. The last days of March came in warm. Not the false warmth of a single afternoon, but a steady softening that lasted from morning to evening, day after day, until the frost went out of the ground in earnest. The ice on Sallow Creek broke into plates that drifted downstream in slow procession, grinding against the banks with a sound like broken glass shifting in a drawer. Clara Harlow watched them pass from the edge of her land, standing where the water had risen to within 3 inches of her measuring stick's notch. She had not moved the stick. She had simply noted the rise each morning and evening, recording the numbers in her journal with the same steady hand she used for everything. The water now carried a pale brown tint, the color of snowmelt moving through miles of topsoil before it arrived here. And it was rising faster than she had expected. The valley had not yet understood what was forming upstream. The warm weather had brought a general relief, a sense that winter had finally released its grip. Men were breaking ground in the higher fields, turning dark furrows that steamed faintly in the morning sun. Plows scraped against stones. Horses blew and stamped. The sound of labor rose and fell across the land, the old rhythm of spring, familiar and reassuring. They had forgotten the floods of previous years. They had not forgotten exactly, but they had pushed the memory aside, the way a person pushes aside a piece of news that does not fit the shape of the day. They planted their corn and their beans and their potatoes, and they did not think about the water that was gathering in the draws and coulees to the north. 100 miles of snowpack beginning to release its grip all at once. Clara thought about nothing else. She walked the boot rows 3 times a day now, not because the seedlings required it, but because the walking helped her think. The beans had grown their first true leaves, broad and dark green, each one catching the morning light at a slightly different angle. The turnips had broken the surface 3 days earlier, their first leaves narrow and pointed, rising from the dark soil in the narrow boots like small green exclamation marks. The squash had not yet emerged, but she could feel the swelling in the soil when she pressed her thumb gently against the surface, the seed crack opening, the root beginning its downward turn. She did not rush them. She watered when the soil felt dry at the depth of her second knuckle, and she left them alone otherwise. The kale, planted in the last boots she had filled, was the most patient of all. It had not yet shown itself above the soil, but she did not worry. Kale took its time. She had learned that in her first summer, from a German woman who grew it in a washtub behind her cabin and harvested it well into November. Everything in its season, the woman had said. You cannot hurry a kale. Clara had remembered that. The first visitor to her claim arrived on the first day of April, a day when the wind had swung around to the south and the air carried the smell of damp earth and something green beginning to stir. It was a boy of about 12 years, thin and sandy-haired, riding a mule that looked older than he was. He stopped at the fence line and called out, asking if she was the woman who grew things in boots. She said she was. He dismounted and walked to the edge of the yard, stopping at a respectful distance, and looked at the rows with an expression that was not mockery and not wonder, but something in between. He said his mother had heard about her planting and wanted to know if it worked. Clara said it seemed to be working so far. The boy nodded and stood a moment longer, then climbed back onto the mule and rode away without another word. She did not know his name. She did not ask. But she noted the visit in her journal, a single line. A boy came to see the boots. He did not laugh. That was the first time anyone had come to look without laughing. It was not the last. By the second week of April, the water in Sallow Creek had risen to the top of the measuring stick. The notch she had cut the previous autumn, which had sat a full hand's breadth above the waterline in February, was now submerged by ½ an inch. She measured it twice to be sure, then went to the shack and opened the journal and wrote down the number. She added a note. The water is at the notch. It has not reached this level in the time I have been here. She underlined the sentence once, then closed the book and went out to check the stones beneath the boot rows. They were still solid. The planks had not shifted. The boots stood upright, and the seedlings were growing. But the water was rising, and she could feel the weight of it in the air, a heaviness that had nothing to do with the weather. The second visitor came on a Friday, a woman from the settlement east of the creek. She was older than Clara, perhaps 50, with a face that had been shaped by wind and sun and the particular patience of someone who has lived a long time on hard land. She did not dismount from her wagon. She stopped at the fence line and called out her name, which was Mary Odell, and said she had heard about the boots and had come to see them for herself. Clara walked to the fence and stood beside the wagon, while Mary Odell looked at the rows with her hand shading her eyes. The beans were climbing their short sticks now. The turnip leaves had broadened. The kale had finally emerged, its first leaves the color of a winter sky, blue-gray and strong. Mary Odell was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I lost my entire garden in the flood of 1868. Every row, everything I had put in the ground." She said it without self-pity, the way a person states a fact that has lost its power to hurt. Clara said she was sorry. Mary Odell shook her head. "I should have thought of something like this," she said. She sat a moment longer, then gathered the reins and said, "If it works, come tell me. I'll remember." Then she drove on, the wagon creaking as it moved away down the creek road. Clara watched her go and felt something that was not pride and not hope, but a quiet confirmation that her work was being seen, if not yet understood. The mockery did not stop, of course. It simply changed shape. Jonas Teal had told the story at the mill so many times that it had become a kind of local legend, embellished with each telling. In the latest version, Clara had not merely planted seeds in old boots, but had been seen singing to them, and had arranged them in the shape of a circle, and had spoken to the creek as though it could hear her. None of this was true, but truth had never been the point of the story. The point was laughter, and the valley was still laughing. She heard fragments of it when she went to the trading post for flour and salt, the way conversation stopped when she entered and resumed in a different key when she passed. She heard it from a group of men gathered outside the mill, one of whom called out, "How are your flowers, Mrs. Harlow?" in a voice that was meant to carry. She did not answer. She did not turn. She walked past them with her purchases in a cloth sack and her gaze fixed on the road ahead. And she did not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. But she noted their names. She noted the tone of their voices. And when she got home, she wrote in the journal, not their words, but the date and the temperature and the height of the water, because those were things she could measure and use. The rain began on the night of April 9th. It started as a drizzle around midnight, a soft and tentative thing that barely disturbed the surface of the creek. By morning, it had settled into a steady, unhurried downpour that showed no sign of stopping. She went out at dawn to check the measuring stick. The water had risen 1.5 inches overnight. She checked the stones beneath the planks. They were holding. The boots were shedding water at their seams, the leather dark but not saturated, the soil inside still at the right consistency when she pressed her finger into it. She went inside and built up the fire and sat by the window, watching the rain fall on the rows of boots, watching the seedlings bend under the weight of the water and spring back when the drops rolled off. She did not pray. She was not a woman given to prayer. But she sat very still and very quiet, and she let her mind settle on each boot, each seedling, each stone, and she asked herself if there was anything she had missed. She could not find anything. She had done what she could. The rest was in the hands of the weather and the water and the slow work of roots finding their way. The rain continued through the 10th and into the 11th. On the morning of the 12th, she woke to a silence that took her a moment to understand. The rain had stopped. The air was still and cool, the clouds beginning to break in the east, a pale yellow light seeping through the gaps. She dressed quickly and went outside. The creek had changed. It was no longer a creek. It had become something else, a broad, moving sheet of water that stretched from the bank on her side to the tree line on the far side, where the cottonwoods stood with their trunks submerged to the height of a man's waist. The water was moving faster than she had ever seen it, carrying branches and fence rails and the dark shape of something that might have been a chicken coop, turning slowly in the current. She walked to the boot rows. The water had reached the base of the flat stones. It had not reached the planks. The seedlings were wet but upright. The beans had climbed another inch since yesterday. The kale had not flinched. She stood among them, her boots wet to the ankle, and she felt the full weight of what she had done settle over her. The flood had come, and her garden was above it. She heard the first shouts from the direction of the Granger place a little before noon. A man's voice, urgent and ragged, calling for help. Then another voice, higher, a woman's. She did not go. It was not callousness that kept her in her yard. It was the understanding that she was one woman with 2 hands and a small cart, and the flood was not something she could stop or divert. She could only hold what she had. She went into the shack and brought out the tarp she had used as a temporary roof her first winter, a heavy piece of oiled canvas that had seen better years but was still waterproof. She spread it over the nearest row of boots, anchoring the corners with stones, creating a low tent that would catch the rain if it returned and keep the seedlings dry. She did the same for the second row, then the third. By the time the sky had darkened again in the late afternoon, all 47 boots were covered. She stood in the yard, soaked to the skin, and watched the water creep another half-inch up the flat stones. It was moving slowly, but it was moving. That evening, a man came to her door. His name was Arthur Pruitt, and he lived 2 miles downstream, where the flood had taken his barn and drowned the calves he had been raising since winter. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and water dripping from his coat, and he asked if she had any dry ground where he might put his remaining stock. A milk cow and 2 hogs he had managed to get to high ground before the current took them. She said she had no field that was dry, but she had a yard that was raised, and she had a row of boots that might not be what he needed, but they were all she had to offer. He looked at the boots, at the seedlings rising from them, at the tarp covering the rows, and he did not laugh. He said he would take what he could get. He tied the cow to the fence post at the edge of the highest ground and set the hogs loose in the yard, and he stood beside Clara in the fading light and watched the water spread across the valley. He said, "I should have listened when I heard what you were doing." I laughed with the rest of them. Clara said nothing. She did not need to. The water was rising, and the boots were holding, and the valley was learning the shape of what it had dismissed. The water did not recede with the morning light. It continued its slow advance across the valley floor, pressing against fence lines and creeping up the sides of root cellars, filling every depression and hollow with the same flat brown surface that now stretched from the eastern tree line to the low ridge in the west. Clara Harlow woke before dawn on the 13th day of April and stood at her window, watching the sky lighten over a world that had become something else entirely. The creek was gone. The road was gone. The lower fields of every farm she could see were gone, submerged beneath a sheet of water that reflected the gray clouds without distortion, as still and patient as a mirror. She pulled on her boots and her coat and went outside to check the rows. The tarps had held through the night. The canvas was heavy with moisture, the oiled surface beaded with droplets that caught the first pale light. She lifted the edge of the nearest tarp and looked beneath it. The boots stood in their rows, the seedlings upright and dark with humidity, the soil surface damp but not saturated. The beans had put out tendrils that curled around the short sticks she had driven into each boot. The kale had broadened overnight, its leaves the color of a winter sky, firm and unbothered. She let the tarp fall back into place and walked the length of the yard to where the water had reached the base of the flat stones. It was higher than yesterday by the width of her thumb. She crouched and measured with her finger against the stone, then stood and looked out across the flooded valley. A fence post stood 20 yards out, its top rail just visible above the surface. Beyond it, a dark shape that might have been a haystack, half submerged, turning slowly in a current too weak to be seen but strong enough to move. She went inside and built the fire and set coffee to boil. She opened the journal and recorded the date, the water level against a new mark she had scratched into the doorframe, the condition of the seedlings, the temperature of the air. She wrote that the tarps were holding and that the stones had not shifted. Then she sat by the fire with the cup in her hands and listened to the silence. There was no wind, no birds, no sound of work from the valley, only the faint trickle of water moving somewhere she could not see, and the occasional groan of a plank shifting in the current. It was the sound of a world waiting, and she was waiting with it. The first neighbor to arrive that morning was a woman named Hetty Crenshaw, who lived on the high ground east of the creek and had not lost her garden, but had spent the night helping her sister's family salvage what they could from a flooded root cellar. She came on foot, her skirt wet to the knee, her face drawn with exhaustion. She stood at the fence line and called out to Clara, asking if she had any dry seed to spare. Clara brought out a small sack of bean seed she had saved from the previous autumn, a handful of turnip seed wrapped in paper, and a twist of kale seed she had been holding for her own second planting. Hetty Crenshaw took them with both hands and held them against her chest and said, "I heard what you were doing with the boots. I thought it was foolish." She paused. "I don't think that anymore." Clara nodded and said nothing. Hetty Crenshaw stood a moment longer, then turned and walked back along the fence line, picking her way through the standing water with the careful steps of a woman carrying something precious. Clara watched her until she disappeared behind the rise, then went back to the rows and lifted the tarps to let the seedlings breathe. The morning passed in a kind of suspended time. The clouds began to thin around noon, and a weak sun appeared, casting long shadows across the water. The light had a diffused quality, as though it were passing through gauze. Clara used the brake to refill the dipper from the rain barrel and water the boots that had dried faster than the others. She worked slowly, methodically, the way she had worked every day since she began this planting. She did not know how many neighbors were watching from their windows or their high ground. She did not look for them. She did her work. By mid-afternoon, the water had stopped rising. She noticed it first on the measuring stick, where the surface had held steady for 2 hours without change. She noted it again at sunset, when the level had dropped a quarter inch. The flood had peaked. She felt it in her chest, a loosening of something she had not realized she had been holding tight. She sat on the step of the sod house and watched the light fade across the drowned valley, the water turning from brown to pewter to a deep, opaque gray. And she let herself feel the small relief of having held what she had. The boots were safe. The seedlings were safe. The work she had begun in February, the work everyone had laughed at, was still standing. The next 3 days brought a slow withdrawal. The water receded the way it had come, by inches, without hurry. Each morning the exposed ground was a little larger, the fence post standing a little taller above the surface. The silt it left behind was pale and fine, coating every surface it had touched, marking the high water line on every building and tree with a precise, unarguable line. Clara walked the edge of her yard each day, watching the water fall away from the base of the flat stones, watching the planks and the boots emerge fully into the air. By the 3rd day, the stones stood dry for the first time in nearly a week. She knelt and pressed her palm against the nearest plank. It was solid. She tested each stack of stones in turn, finding none that had shifted, none that had settled unevenly. She packed a handful of fresh soil around the base of the loosest stack, tamping it with the heel of her boot until it held. The seedlings had grown visibly during the flood. The beans had climbed their sticks and were beginning to send out side shoots. The kale had put on 3 new leaves each, broad and blue-gray, the largest of them the size of her palm. The turnips had thickened at the base, the tops of the roots beginning to swell above the soil line. And the squash, which she had been most worried about, had set small yellow blossoms that would become fruit if the weather held. She stood among them in the late afternoon light and felt the warmth of the sun on her face. And she allowed herself a single moment of something close to satisfaction. Then she went inside and opened the journal and wrote down everything she had observed. The visits began in earnest after the water had fully retreated. Farmers whose fields had been drowned came to her yard to stand and look at the boot rows. Some came with questions. Some came in silence. Some came with a pride they could not quite swallow, asking about the method as though it were a casual curiosity rather than a desperate need. She answered each question the same way, plainly and without condescension, as though she had been expecting them all along. She showed them how the stones were stacked, how the planks were laid, how the boots were filled and seeded. She let them handle the soil mixture, feel its texture, smell its richness. She did not charge for the information. She did not offer to build their planters for them. She gave them what they asked for and let them decide what to do with it. But not everyone came in humility. There was a man named Elbert Moss who had a farm 2 miles north of the creek and had lost half his corn crop to the flood. He came to Clara's yard on the 3rd day after the water had receded, riding a horse that was caked with dried mud to the belly. He did not dismount. He sat in the saddle and looked at the boot rows with an expression that was not curiosity and not appreciation, but something harder. He said, "I heard you grew things in trash." Clara said she grew them in boots. He said, "It's not farming. It's a trick. It won't last." Clara said nothing. She had nothing to say. He sat in the saddle a moment longer, then turned his horse and rode away without another word. She watched him go, and she felt the old weight settle back onto her shoulders, the weight of being dismissed by a man who had lost everything and still could not bring himself to admit that a woman alone on low ground had seen something he had not. The days warmed. The sun grew stronger. The valley began the slow work of recovery, the mud drying and cracking, the first green shoots of surviving plants pushing up through the silt. Clara's boot garden flourished. The beans were climbing higher than she had expected, the tendrils reaching for the sky with the determination of things that had not been told they were not supposed to succeed. The kale had become a dense cluster of blue-gray leaves, each one broad enough to cover a dinner plate. The squash blossoms had opened and set fruit, 4 small green spheres that grew larger each day. The turnips were ready. She harvested the first of them on a Thursday morning in early May, pulling them gently from the soil of their narrow boots, brushing the dark earth from their pale skins. They were perfect, straight and smooth and firm, the roots having followed the straight walls of the boots downward without deviation. She washed one at the pump and bit into it. It was sweet and crisp, and tasted like the soil it had grown in, the mineral richness of the creek silt and the ash and the compost all present in the flavor. She stood at the pump and ate the whole thing, standing there in the morning light, and she felt something rise in her chest that she had not felt in a very long time. It was not triumph. It was not pride. It was the simple, quiet certainty that she had been right. The second week of May brought a visitor she had not expected. It was Jonas Teal, the miller who had laughed first and loudest, the man whose story had spread across the valley like a fire. He came in the late afternoon, walking along the creek road with his hands in his pockets, his shoulders low. He stopped at the fence line and stood there without calling out, as though he were not sure he had the right to enter. Clara saw him from the garden. She waited. After a long moment, she walked to the fence and stood on the other side of it, not opening the gate. He looked at the boot rows over her shoulder. The beans were in full leaf now, the vines heavy with blossoms. The squash had 3 fruits the size of her fist. The kale had bolted, but she had harvested the outer leaves twice already, and they were still producing. Jonas Teal looked at all of it, and his face did something complicated, a series of expressions passing across it too quickly to name. Finally he said, "I was wrong." He said it quietly, without looking at her, his eyes fixed on the green rows. "I told the story at the mill. I made it sound like a joke." He stopped. The silence stretched. She did not fill it. He said, "I lost my spring planting. The water took it all, the whole field. I have nothing." He looked at her then, and she saw something in his face that she had not expected. It was not shame, exactly, but the raw edge of a pride that had been worn thin by loss. She said, "Do you want to know how it works?" He nodded. She opened the gate. She walked him through the boot rows, showing him the mixture, the stones, the planks, the drainage, the way the leather breathed. He asked questions, and she answered them. He did not make any more jokes. He stayed until the light began to fade, and when he left, he carried with him a bundle of kale leaves and a turnip and a small cloth sack of saved seed. He did not thank her, not in words, but he paused at the gate and looked back at the rows one last time, and then he walked away into the evening. Clara stood in the yard and watched him go, and she thought about the weight of a man's pride when it has nowhere to go but down. She did not feel victorious. She felt only the quiet rightness of having been patient. The last week of May brought a warm spell that pushed the beans into full flower and swelled the squash to the size of a child's head. Clara harvested the first full basket of kale and took it to the trading post, where the storekeeper looked at it with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something between surprise and respect. He paid her in trade, flour and salt, and a length of cotton cloth that she folded carefully and put in the cart. She was on her way home when she saw the sign. It was nailed to the post outside the mill, a fresh plank of pine with letters burned into it with a hot wire. It read, "High Water Gardening, Seed and Supplies. Inquire within." She stopped the cart and sat in the seat looking at the sign. Jonas Teal had not only learned, he was teaching. She gathered the reins and drove on, and she did not look back. The boots were still growing, the seedlings were still reaching, and the valley was beginning to understand that sometimes the strangest thing a person could do was also the only thing that would save them. June came in dry. The kind of dry that did not announce itself with a single scorching day, but settled in gradually, each morning a little warmer than the last, each afternoon a little longer, until the valley realized it had not seen rain in nearly 3 weeks. The ground that had been saturated by the spring flood began to harden at the surface, cracking into plates that curled at the edges like old bread. The creek, which had run high and brown through April, had dropped to a slow trickle by the middle of the month. Clara noticed it on her morning walk, the way the water no longer filled the channel from bank to bank, but moved in a narrow ribbon down the center, leaving wide margins of drying mud that crumbled under her boots. She noted it in the journal. She noted the temperature, the wind direction, the condition of the soil in the boots. The kale had slowed its growth, the outer leaves beginning to yellow at the tips. The beans had stopped climbing and were putting their energy into the pods. The squash had set a second wave of fruit, smaller than the first, but firm and healthy. She adjusted her watering, giving each boot a deeper soak every other day rather than a light watering each evening, letting the moisture penetrate to the bottom of the leather where the roots could reach it. The soil mixture she had developed held the water longer than the ground did. She had tested that in the first summer, filling a hole in the yard with the same mixture and timing how long it stayed damp compared to the native soil. The ash and silt and compost held moisture like a sponge, releasing it slowly, giving the roots time to drink. She had known that before she planted. Now she was grateful for it. The dry weather did not trouble her at first. It was normal for June in Nebraska, a stretch of clear, hot days that tested the endurance of everything that grew. But by the third week, the normal had begun to tip into something else. The sky stayed a pale, bleached blue from morning to night, and the sun pressed down with an intention that felt personal. The corn in the higher fields began to curl its leaves, the edges turning brown and crisp. The potato vines wilted in the afternoon and recovered only slowly in the evening. At the trading post, the talk had turned to the weather in the particular way that farming people talk about weather when it begins to threaten, a mix of observation and hope and the quiet dread of things they cannot control. Clara heard the word drought spoken for the first time on a Thursday afternoon, spoken by a man she did not know, standing on the porch of the store. He said it low, as though saying it too loud might make it more real. She bought her supplies and drove home and watered the boots. The first week of July brought no rain. The creek had become a series of shallow pools, connected by threads of moving water no wider than her hand. The frogs that had sung through May had gone silent. The birds had moved on, seeking the river. The valley lay under a haze of heat that shimmered above every field, distorting the shapes of barns and windmills in the distance. Clara woke each morning to the same white sky and the same hot breath of wind coming from the south, and she walked to the boot rows and lifted the tarp she had begun to use as shade cloth, rigging them on sticks to block the worst of the afternoon sun. The seedlings had adapted. The kale had stopped growing, but it had not died. It held its blue-gray leaves firm, waiting. The beans had produced their first full harvest, pods thick and green, and she picked them in the cool of early morning, filling a basket that she carried to the house. The squash had ripened, 3 of them large enough to feed her for a week. She cut one open and roasted it in the stove, eating it with salt and butter, and she felt the nourishment of it in her bones. The boots were still producing. The laughter had stopped. Jonas Teal had become an unexpected ally. He had built a set of plank risers behind his mill, using boots he had collected from the same piles Clara had visited months before. His first attempt had been uneven, the stones laid too close together, the planks warping in the heat. He had come to her yard one evening in late June, hat in hand, and asked her to look at what he had built. She had walked the rows with him, pointing out the gaps where the stones did not support the planks, the boots that were too close together, crowding the roots. He had listened without defending himself, and the next week he had rebuilt the whole thing. Now he had beans climbing and kale starting, and he had begun to give away seedlings to anyone who asked. The mill had become a kind of informal headquarters for the new method, a place where farmers stopped to look and ask questions, and sometimes walk away with a boot full of soil and a seed pressed into it. Clara did not mind. She had not built the method to own it. She had built it to survive, and if others survived with her, that was the shape of a thing she could live with. But not everyone had come around. Elbert Moss had not come to her yard again, but his voice carried. He had been seen at the mill, standing apart, listening to Jonas Teal describe the boot method and shaking his head. He had been heard at the trading post, saying that the flood had been an accident of weather, that the boot garden was a novelty, that real farming meant putting seed in the ground and trusting the land. He said it with the conviction of a man who had lost everything twice and could not afford to believe in a third way. Clara heard about his words secondhand, as she heard most things, and she did not let them settle. She had her work. She had her rows. She had the small cloth-bound journal filling with observations that would outlast any man's opinion. The drought deepened through July. The creek pools shrank to mudholes. The windmills turned slower, pulling less water from wells that had never been shallower. The corn in the valley curled and yellowed, and some fields were cut early for silage, the stalks thin and pale, the ears stunted or missing altogether. Clara's boot rows stayed green. She had to water them more often now, carrying buckets from the well 3 times a day. But the well was deep, and the water was sweet, and she did not mind the work. She had learned to read the boots the way a sailor reads the sky, noting which ones dried fastest, which held moisture longest, which had developed small cracks in the leather that let the water escape too quickly. She patched the cracks with a mixture of tallow and ash, pressing it into the leather with her thumb until the seal held. The boots adapted. The seedlings adapted. The whole system had become a living thing, responsive and patient, and full of the quiet intelligence of something that had been thought through. The crisis that broke the valley's resistance did not come from the sky or the creek. It came from the ground itself, in the form of a blight. It appeared first in the cornfields along the eastern ridge, a pale discoloration on the lower leaves that spread upward with alarming speed. Within a week, it had jumped to the potatoes. Within 2 weeks, it had crossed the creek and entered the lower fields, where the soil was still heavy from the spring flood, and the plants were already weakened by drought. The blight took everything it touched, turning green leaves to brown mush in a matter of days, collapsing stalks that had stood for months, filling the air with a smell of rot that carried on the hot wind. The farmers watched their crops die in front of them, and there was nothing they could do. They had no fungicide, they had no cure. They had only the ground and the weather, and the terrible patience of a blight that did not care about their labor. Clara's boot rows were not affected. She had read about blight in an agricultural pamphlet she had traded for 2 years ago, a slim booklet of advice for the prairie farmer that had cost her a quarter-pound of dried beans. She had read it twice, and noted the conditions that favored the disease: wet soil, poor drainage, plants stressed by drought and then soaked by sudden rain. Her boots drained freely. The soil mixture did not stay wet at the surface. The plants were spaced far enough apart to let the air move between them, and she had been careful to water at the base of each boot, never wetting the leaves. The blight found nothing it could use. Her beans remained green. Her kale remained blue-gray. Her squash swelled on the vine. She stood among them in the terrible heat of late July and felt the weight of what she had done pressing against the suffering of the valley. The first farmer to ask for help was a man named Theodore Gray, who had lost his entire corn crop to the blight. He came to her door on a Sunday afternoon, a day when the heat had driven everyone indoors, the air thick and still and heavy with the smell of rotting vegetation. He stood at the gate and said he had heard about her method. He said he had laughed at first, but now he had nothing left. He asked if she would show him how to build a set of boot rows before the season was too far gone to start anything new. She said she would. She spent the afternoon with him in his barn, sorting through a pile of old boots he had gathered from his neighbors, showing him how to test the leather, how to mix the soil, how to lay the stones. He listened with the attention of a drowning man being shown a rope. When she left, he was still working, filling the first boot with the mixture she had taught him, pressing the seed in with his thumb. The visits multiplied. Each day brought another farmer, another woman, another family who had lost their planting and had nowhere else to turn. She showed them all the same way, without favor or judgment, without reminding them that they had laughed. She did not need to remind them. The memory of their laughter hung in the air between them, unspoken but present, and she let it be there without addressing it. She had never needed their approval. She had only needed the method to work, and it had worked, and that was enough. By the second week of August, the drought had broken. A slow, steady rain moved in from the west, falling through an afternoon and into the night, soaking the cracked earth, filling the creek beds, washing the dust from the leaves of every surviving plant. Clara stood at her window and watched it fall, listened to the sound of it on the sod roof, the drip of it from the eaves. She went out in the morning to find the boot rows beaded with water, the seedlings refreshed, the kale leaves holding the rain in cupped shapes that caught the light. The valley had survived, barely. The fields were brown, and the blight had taken what the drought had not, but the work of recovery had begun. And in the yards of a dozen farms along Sallow Creek, the boots were being filled and planted, the stones being laid, the method spreading like the roots of a thing that had finally found its ground. Clara walked the rows in the cool morning, checking each boot, pressing the soil, adjusting a stone that had settled after the rain. The sun rose over the ridge, warm and golden, and she felt the quiet satisfaction of a season that had tested her and found her ready. She did not know what the autumn would bring, or the winter, or the spring beyond. She knew only that the boots were holding and the roots were deep, and the valley was learning, slowly, the way land itself learns. And that was work enough for any woman. The rain that broke the drought did not stop after one night. It settled into a pattern, 3 days of gentle, steady moisture, followed by a day of cloud, and then another round, as though the sky had decided to make up for lost time in the most measured way possible. The creek rose again, but slowly, without urgency. The ground that had cracked and hardened softened into something dark and receptive, and the valley began to green in patches, not with the lushness of spring, but with the determined recovery of a land that had not forgotten how to grow. Clara watched it from her yard, where the boot rows had begun to look less like an experiment and more like a garden, full and confident and productive. The beans had produced a second wave of pods, smaller than the first, but tender and sweet. The squash vines had spread beyond the boots, trailing along the planks and over the edges, their broad leaves covering the stones like a living blanket. The kale had recovered from the heat and was putting out new leaves from the center, a deep blue-green that seemed to hold the color of the rain. She harvested in the cool of the morning, filling baskets that she carried to the trading post or divided among the families who had begun to appear at her gate with increasing regularity. They came with questions, with thanks, with small offerings of trade, a jar of honey, a length of rope, a pair of wool socks knitted by hands she did not know. She accepted these without ceremony and returned to her work. The boot garden had become a kind of landmark, a place people pointed to when they gave directions, a thing that appeared in conversations at the mill and the post office and the church that held services once a month in a schoolhouse on the ridge. The laughter had not stopped entirely, but it had changed its character. It was no longer the laughter of dismissal. It was the laughter of surprise, of a joke that had turned around and revealed a truth the joker had not expected. Elbert Moss had not come to her yard. He had not asked for her help. He had watched his corn die, watched the blight take what the drought had left, and he had done nothing but shake his head and say that the season was cursed, that the land had turned against him, that no method could save a crop when the weather would not cooperate. He said these things loudly, in public places, where others could hear and nod along. But the others were nodding less now. They had seen the boot rows. They had tasted the beans and the kale and the squash that came out of the leather containers. They had begun to build their own. The method was spreading like water finding its level, and Elbert Moss was standing on the high ground, watching it rise. The first frost came on the 22nd of September, a light dusting that silvered the grass and left the boot rows untouched beneath the tarps Clara had begun to draw over them at dusk. She had known it was coming. She had felt it in the quality of the evening air, the way it cooled faster than usual, the way the stars seemed sharper and closer. She had gone out at sunset and covered the most vulnerable plants, the beans that were still producing, the squash vines that had not yet finished. The kale she left uncovered. Kale could take a frost, she had learned. It sweetened in the cold, the leaves growing tender and rich. She checked the rows at first light, lifting the tarps to find the beans beaded with melted frost, unharmed. The squash leaves had wilted at the edges, but the fruit was firm. She harvested what was ready and left the rest to see what the season would give. The valley had changed with the frost. The cornfields that had survived the blight were being cut, the stalks stacked for feed, the ears shelled and stored. The potato diggers had brought in what they could, small and scabbed by the dry summer. The harvest was thin, the poorest most families could remember. At the trading post, the storekeeper had reduced his prices, knowing that trade would be scarce. The talk was of winter, of how much hay had been put up, how many hogs would be butchered, whether the coal shipment from the east would arrive before the river froze. It was the talk of people who had been tested and found wanting, and they carried it with a gravity that Clara recognized from her first winter, the weight of survival reduced to its simplest terms. She had her own preparations. The boot rows had produced more than she could eat. She had dried beans by the sackful, stored in cloth bags hung from the rafters. She had canned squash in jars she had traded for, sealed with wax and stacked in the root cellar she had dug by hand the previous summer. The kale she had blanched and dried, crumbling the leaves into a powder that would last through the winter and flavor every stew and soup she made. The turnips she had packed in sand in a wooden box, buried in the cellar where they would keep until spring. She had enough, and more than enough. She had begun to plan how she would use the surplus, not for trade, but for the families she knew would not have enough. The first of them came in October, a young couple named the Whitmans, who had homesteaded the previous spring on a quarter section east of the creek. They had lost their corn to the flood, and their potatoes to the blight, and they had nothing left but a milk cow and a thin sow, and the hope that they could make it through the winter on what little they had saved. The wife came to Clara's door on a cold afternoon, a thin blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her hands red from the wind. She asked if Clara had any seed to spare for the spring. Clara brought her inside and gave her dried beans and a jar of canned squash and a sack of kale powder, and she told her to come back in March for seed. The woman cried, not loudly, but with the quiet shaking of someone who had been holding herself together for too long. Clara put a hand on her shoulder and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The woman left with her bundle, and Clara watched her walk down the road, and she felt the shape of something she had not expected, the weight of being the person others turned to. November came in cold and clear. The frost deepened into a hard freeze that killed the last of the squash vines and stiffened the leather of the boots into a rigid shape that cracked if she pressed it too hard. She had moved the remaining plants into the sod house, a dozen boots with kale still producing small leaves in the warm air by the stove. The rest of the boots she had emptied and stacked against the wall of the lean-to, the soil returned to the compost pile, the leather too worn to use again. She had salvaged what she could, but the boots were not meant to last forever. They were vessels for a season, and the season was done. The expanded claim she had filed in the summer had been surveyed and recorded. It added 80 acres of low ground along the creek, land that had flooded in April and would flood again, land that no one else had wanted. She had paid for it with the proceeds from her harvest, cash that had changed hands at the land office without comment. The clerk had looked at her with something like recognition this time, not surprise. He had stamped the papers and handed them across the counter, and she had folded them into her coat and walked out without a word. She had plans for that land. She had been drawing them in the journal, planning the arrangement of the boot rows, the placement of the stone foundations, the runoff channels that would carry excess water away from the plantings. She had learned what the flood had taught her, and she intended to use every lesson. The community gathering came on the third Saturday of November, a harvest supper held in the schoolhouse on the ridge. Clara had not planned to attend. She did not care for gatherings, the noise and the eyes and the conversations that stopped when she approached. But the invitation had been delivered by Mary Odell, the woman who had come to see the boots in April, and Mary Odell had said, "You should come. They want to thank you." Clara had smiled, a thin smile, and said she would think about it. On the day of the supper, she found herself walking the road to the ridge, a basket of dried kale and canned squash in her arms, her boots crunching on the frozen ground. She did not know why she had come. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was the faint hope that the season of laughter had truly ended. The schoolhouse was full, lantern lights spilling from the windows, the sound of voices, and the smell of cooking drifting out into the cold air. Clara stood at the door a moment before entering. Inside, the long tables had been pushed together and covered with cloths, laden with dishes brought by every family in the valley. There was roast chicken and salt pork, and boiled potatoes and cornbread made from the last of the stored meal. There was pie made from dried apples and sweetened with molasses. There was a bowl of turnips that someone had grown in a boot planter, set in the center of the table as though it were a centerpiece. Clara saw it and looked away. She was given a seat near the stove, where the warmth could reach her. She set her basket on the table and sat down, and the conversations around her did not stop. They continued, but they shifted, angled toward her in small ways, a glance, a nod, a pause in a sentence that carried a weight of acknowledgement. She ate her meal in silence, listening to the talk around her, the stories of the summer, the losses and the small victories. The flood was mentioned, and the drought, and the blight. And then someone said her name. It was a man named Howard Bell, who farmed the high ground north of the mill and had lost his entire planting to the drought. He said, "Clara Harlow's garden didn't drown." He said it simply, as a statement of fact, and there was a murmur of agreement around the table. Clara kept her eyes on her plate. She did not look up. The talk moved on, but the shape of it had changed. She could feel it in the air, the way the room had oriented itself toward her without her doing anything to invite it. She finished her meal and rose to leave before the pies were served, making her way through the crowd toward the door. A hand touched her arm. She turned. It was Mary Odell, her face warm in the lantern light. She said, "I wanted you to know. The boots I planted in May, I harvested enough to put by for the winter. I wouldn't have had that without you." Clara nodded. She wanted to say something, but the words would not come. She pressed Mary Odell's hand once and walked out into the cold. The night was clear, and the stars were bright, scattered across the sky like seeds thrown by a generous hand. She walked home along the frozen road, her breath clouding in front of her, the lights of the schoolhouse growing smaller behind her. She thought about the summer, the flood, the drought, the blight, the long days of carrying water and patching leather and answering questions from people who had laughed at her in the spring. She thought about the boots, stacked now in the lean-to, empty and waiting for spring. She thought about the land she had bought, the low ground along the creek, the soil that flooded and would flood again, the soil that no one else wanted. She thought about what she would plant there and how she would plant it, and what the valley would say when they saw it. She reached her gate and stopped. The sod house was dark, the stove gone cold. She stood in the yard a moment, looking at the place where the boot rows had been, the empty planks now stacked against the wall, the flat stones arranged in a neat pile. The ground was bare and frozen, waiting. She felt the cold seep through her coat. She went inside and lit the lamp and built the fire, and she sat at the table with the journal open in front of her. She dipped the pen and wrote the date, November 22nd, the harvest supper. She paused. Then she wrote, "I think they understand now." She closed the book and set it on the shelf and sat in the warmth of the fire, listening to the wind move across the prairie. The season of laughter was over. The season of planting was still months away. But she was ready. She had always been ready. The winter would pass, the creek would rise again, and she would be waiting with her boots and her stones and her quiet, patient certainty. Winter passed the way it always passed on the Nebraska prairie, in long stretches of cold that seemed to have no end, punctuated by brief thaws that fooled the early bulbs into sending up green shoots only to freeze them again. Clara Harlow spent the months in the sod house, reading and mending and planning. She turned the pages of her journal, reviewing the notes from the previous season, calculating the adjustments she would make. The boots had worked, but they could work better. The stone stacks could be higher, the planks wider. the spacing between rows more generous to allow for air movement. She had learned that the squash needed more room than she had given them, that the kale could be planted earlier, that the beans benefited from a taller support. She filled page after page with these calculations, her hand moving steadily across the paper in the lamplight. The snow came and went. The creek froze solid, then thawed, then froze again. The wind scoured the valley, rattling the door of the sod house, finding every crack and crevice. Clara kept the fire burning and the kettle warm, and she waited. She had learned to wait. The land would tell her when it was time. She listened to it in the mornings when she stepped outside to check the sky, in the evenings when the wind dropped and the silence settled over the prairie like a blanket. She listened, and she waited, and she planned. March came in with a softness that felt almost tentative, as though the season were testing the ground before committing. The snow melted in earnest, running off the fields in bright ribbons that caught the light. The creek rose, but slowly, without the urgency of the previous year. Clara walked the boundary of her expanded claim on a mild afternoon, her boots pressing into the softening ground. She had marked the corners with stakes driven deep, and she stood at the southern edge and looked across the low ground that would flood when the snowmelt came down from the north. She had already drawn the plan. The boot rows would run east to west here, following the contour of the land, the stone foundations built higher than last year, the planks reinforced with cross-bracing. She had saved boots from every pile she could find over the winter, and the lean-to was full to bursting with leather of every shape and condition. She had already begun filling them with the soil mixture, working in the evenings by lamplight, packing the compost and ash and silt into each boot with the same methodical care she had used the first time. She had 112 boots ready. She had seed enough for twice that. She was ready. The planting began in the third week of March, earlier than the previous year, while the ground was still too wet for conventional plowing. She worked alone, carrying the boots from the lean-to the stone foundations she had laid along the new claim, setting each one in its place, pressing the seed into the prepared soil. The neighbors saw her from the road, a solitary figure moving across the low ground, and this time they did not laugh. Some stopped to watch. Some called out greetings. A few came to help, carrying boots, stacking stones, fetching water from the well. She accepted their help without comment, directing them with short gestures and simple instructions. The work went faster with extra hands, and by the end of the first week, all 112 boots were in place, seeded and watered, standing in neat rows on the raised planks above the dark soil. The flood came in the second week of April, earlier than the year before, driven by a warm rain that fell for 3 days without pause. The creek rose over its banks and spread across the low ground, filling every depression, covering the fields that had been plowed and planted by farmers who had hoped the previous year was an anomaly. Clara watched it from the rise near her sod house, standing in the rain with a canvas coat pulled over her shoulders. The water crept across her new claim, reaching the base of the stone stacks, rising against the flat stones, pressing against the planks. She watched it the way she had watched it the year before, without fear, without hope, with the steady attention of someone who had done the calculations and trusted the result. The boots stood above the water. The seedlings, just beginning to show their first leaves, remained dry. The water rose another inch, and then another, and then it stopped. She stood in the rain until she was certain, then went inside and built the fire and wrote the date in the journal. The water receded more quickly this year, the warm weather following the rain, the sun breaking through on the fourth day. The valley emerged from the flood with a layer of silt that would enrich the soil for those who could wait, but many could not. The conventional fields that had been planted before the rain were lost, the seed washed away or drowned, the furrows erased by the slow current. The farmers who had planted early, trusting the old signs, had lost everything they had put into the ground. They gathered at the mill, at the trading post, in the schoolhouse, their voices carrying the same flat tone of survival that Clara remembered from the previous spring. They had been tested again, and they had failed again. Elbert Moss had planted early. He had been the first to break ground in March, the first to put seed in the earth, the first to declare that he would not be swayed by a woman's experiment with old boots. He had planted 40 acres of corn and 10 acres of potatoes, and the flood had taken every row. He stood at the mill on the 5th day after the water receded, his hands in his pockets, his face set in an expression that was not quite anger and not quite defeat. Jonas Teal was there, describing the boot rows on the low ground, the way they had stood above the water, the seedlings already reaching for the sun. Elbert Moss listened. He did not interrupt. He did not walk away. He stood there until the conversation ended, and then he asked a question. He asked where he could find boots. He came to Clara's yard on a Saturday afternoon, the last Saturday of April, when the cottonwoods had leafed out and the air smelled of damp earth and new growth. He came on foot, his boots caked with mud, his hat in his hands. He stopped at the gate and waited. Clara saw him from the garden, where she was checking the rows on the new claim. She walked to the gate and stood on the other side of it, the same position she had taken with Jonas Teal almost a year ago. Elbert Moss looked at the boot rows behind her, the long lines of leather and green stretching across the low ground, the seedlings upright and healthy, the water still standing in the lower parts of the field but nowhere near the planks. He looked for a long time. Then he said, "Clara Harlow, I was wrong." He said it slowly, as though the words had to be pulled from somewhere deep. "I was wrong about the boots. I was wrong about you. I have lost everything I planted, and I have no right to ask for help. But I am asking." She looked at him in the long silence that followed. She saw a man who had been certain of his way, certain enough to mock hers, and who had been stripped of that certainty by the same land that had tested her and found her ready. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel vindication. She felt the quiet satisfaction of a thing that had been proven true, and the weight of being the one who held the answer. She opened the gate. She said, "I have boots in the lean-to that have already been filled with soil. I have seed that I saved for this. I have a method that works, and I will show you how to do it." He followed her to the lean-to. She showed him the boots, the soil mixture, the stones, the planks. She answered his questions without condescension, the same way she had answered every question since the flood. He listened with the attention of a man who had been humbled and was determined to learn. When he left, he carried a sack of boots and a bundle of seed and a page torn from her journal with the proportions written in her small, precise hand. He paused at the gate and looked back. He said, "I'll be planting in the morning." She nodded. He walked away, and she watched him go, and she understood that the valley had finally turned. The recognition came in small gestures through the weeks that followed. A basket of eggs left on her step by a woman whose garden had flooded. A length of new rope left at the gate by a man whose son had helped her carry boots. A handshake at the trading post from a farmer who had spent the previous summer laughing at her. She accepted each one without comment, without ceremony, and she returned to her work. The boot rows on the new claim were thriving. The beans were climbing. The kale was broad and blue-gray. The squash had set fruit. The method had become ordinary, and that was the highest compliment it could receive. The community gathering at the end of summer was held in the same schoolhouse, but the mood was different. The tables were laden with produce from the boot gardens that now dotted the valley. There were beans and kale and squash and turnips brought by families who had lost everything the previous year and had learned to plant above the water. The centerpiece of the table was a single boot, cleaned and polished, filled with soil and planted with a flowering vine that had climbed a small trellis. It was not a joke. It was a symbol. Clara sat at the table and ate her meal in silence. But this time the silence around her was not the silence of exclusion. It was the silence of respect. After the meal, Jonas Teal stood and asked for attention. He spoke about the flood, the drought, the blight. He spoke about the year everyone had laughed at a woman who planted in old boots. And then he spoke about how that woman had saved the valley. He said her name. Clara Harlow. The room went quiet. She felt the weight of every eye on her. She did not stand. She did not speak. She looked at the boot in the center of the table, the flowering vine climbing its trellis, and she thought about the long winter evenings when she had filled the first boots with soil, not knowing if it would work, not caring what anyone thought. She thought about the creek rising, the seedlings holding, the valley learning. She thought about the small, cloth-covered journal on the shelf in the sod house, filled with observations and measurements, and the patient record of a method that had grown from a seed of an idea into a harvest that fed a community. She looked at the boot on the table, and she understood that it was not the boot that mattered. It was what the boot held. It was the soil, and the seed, and the patient work of a woman who had refused to believe that the land could not be outsmarted. She rose from the table and walked to the door. The night was clear, the stars scattered across the sky like seeds thrown by a generous hand. She stood on the step of the schoolhouse and looked out across the valley, the dark shapes of fields and fences, and the distant glow of a lantern in a window. Somewhere out there, a boot garden was growing. Somewhere out there, a farmer who had laughed at her was eating kale from a planter she had taught him to build. She thought about the winter to come, the spring beyond it, the floods and droughts and blights that would test the valley again. And she thought about the method, the stones and the planks and the boots, the raised rows that would hold above the water. The land would flood again, the creek would rise, but the gardens would hold. This is Elias Vance, and you have been listening to Frontier Secrets. Subscribe and step back in time. The frontier hides more than it shows.